Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. You know, often when I'm waiting in a waiting room somewhere that have National Geographic magazines or similar magazines about nature, and again sometimes find articles that refer to ape men, and you see these illustrations of people that essentially look like humans overall in their build, but yet they're covered with fur and they've got more sort of a blend of ape and human sort of face. And this whole concept that humans have evolved from ape man or from ape-like creature over millions of years dominates these sort of illustrated science books. And of course this is what the students in our schools and universities are told, and of course the illustrations of these particular evolutionary intermediates seem to reinforce this whole concept that this actually is a true account, that there were ape men that lived in the past. But we need to remember, of course, that these drawings that are made are simply the imaginations of the artists that drew them. We haven't actually found any remains that actually show what these people look like. In the past, of course, we've found, bits and pieces of skeletons that have been claimed to have been these intermediates. But in general, most of the time, those pieces that we've found have either later been shown to be actual ape species, or they've found to be actual human species. Now, it's interesting that the Bible tells us that essentially all the humans that all humans today are descendants from Noah and his family after the flood, which was about 4,500 years ago, roughly. And so all the people today would be descended from them. And it's interesting, if we look at the Bible account, in particularly in Genesis chapter 10, it gives the generations of the descendants of Noah. So Genesis chapter 10 starts, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and sons were born to them after the flood. And then it lists them, and lists the sons, like the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Teres. And then it would go through the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Ripah, Togmara, and the sons of Jamin, and so forth, Tarshish, Kittim. And a lot of these names, of course, now, we know that there are towns and regions that were named after these descendants. For example, we then go the sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. And then we have the sons of Canaan are listed there. Canaan became the father of Sidon, and so forth. And he was father of Heth and the Jebusites and the Amorites. And of course, we know that these were people that, again, towns were named after, nations were named after. For example, Egypt, because Egypt is just the Greek translation of Mizraim, which was the other name for Ham's son. And so, and again, today we, Egypt is Mizra in the local language. I think I've mentioned before, I have an Encyclopedia Britannica Atlas at home, and it doesn't have Egypt labelled as Egypt. It has Egypt labelled as Mizra. So, again, this fits history. This fits the biblical account of the descendants of Noah actually fit what we actually observe today. The towns, the history, and so forth fits the biblical account of the descendants of Noah as recorded in the Bible there in Genesis chapter 10. And when we look at these European countries, their histories, their folklore go back to these descendants there. And this I find is really, really fascinating. It's interesting in Genesis chapter 11, it says, "Now the whole earth had one language and few words, and men migrated to the east and settled there." And it goes on with the account of building the Tower of Babel and how God then confused the languages, and the people separated into different groups with their languages. It's interesting, if we look at this date of 4,500 years ago, this is really of the flood and the people separating out at that particular time, the different descendants, and then moving in the different directions when their languages became confused, or when they were given different languages by God. God confused their language and separated them up into different tribal groups. It's very consistent with population statistics and also with language, because the origin of language is one of the major challenges for evolution theory. And I have a colleague that I've corresponded with who's an expert, a world authority in the area of linguistics, and he points out that this is a major challenge for evolutionary theory, and he is a creationist. And when we look at the statistics, if we start with Noah's family and calculating population growth using the generation span of 40 years and an average of 2.5 children per family, the present world population would be obtained in those 4,500 years. Now, we know that in the past people had much larger families. As a matter of fact, up until fairly recently, with the advancement of reproductive contraceptives, the number of children in most households was much larger than that. And, families of, I know with my parents, they came from families of 6 children and 8 children respectively. And that was typical of that sort of generation at that time. And so we would expect the population, when you have that many children, and we knew of families that had, 12 children in their family, the rate at which the population is going to grow very, very quickly. But, of course, we then have, disease and war and this sort of thing. So the calculation of just 2.5 children per generation is very, very conservative, very conservative. And yet we would reach the world's population in those 4,500 years, just at that very conservative level. Now, on the other hand, if human beings supposedly evolved even as recently as 100,000 years ago, the question needs to be asked, where are all the graves and remains of the countless billions of people that would have lived and died throughout that period? And where are all their artefacts? And I think this is a really, really important question that challenges this whole caveman, ape man sort of picture that is presented to us in these, history and geographic sort of television programs and books and articles and so forth. Every now and again they find some caves with cave paintings or some primitive utensils in them, and we have this picture painted of these really people that supposedly evolved over this long period of time. But I guess you can ask, well, what about the alleged Ape Man? Well, I was reading quite an interesting article by Dr. Andrew Snelling, who is a PhD geologist, but has worked in this area, looking at fossils and remains and so forth. And I was reading an article that was by him titled "Alleged Ape Man, Caveman and the True History of Man." And he writes, but what about the alleged ape man? The hominid fossils that are claimed by evolutionists to be our ancestors are found in localised sediments at the Earth's surface that are clearly post-date the flood. And he talks about how different kinds or genera of animals must have come off the ark and rapidly diversified into today's species, and they migrated across the earth and became established in different breeding populations. He then looks at the primates and he says, among the primates, minor physical differences would have developed during such speciation. And the hominid fossils are often fragmentary, with critical skeletal pieces missing. But from the available evidence, most of those remains would appear to be just variations of the pygmy chimpanzees and their relevance. And this includes Australopithecines, whose name anyway simply means southern apes. He goes on, the remains of a few of these creatures became locally buried and fossilised primarily in parts of Africa. When we look at these particular fossils that are found, they're few and far between, and the evidence seems to fit that, again, they were just genetic variations of apes, not apes solely changing into humans. On the other hand, we know that if all the descendants of the world, all the people in the world descended essentially from the three sons of Noah, so they're carrying that genetic information and their wives. And it says, he writes, instead of spreading out across the Earth's surface, of course, Noah's descendants, who still had one language and culture, stayed together in the Tigris-Euphrates area and built the city called Babel. Now, genetic variations in the population means that through intermarriage, there was a complete gradation of external human features, such as colour shades of skin, hair, eye shapes, and so on. The biblical account then describes how God directly intervened to confuse the people's language, thus creating turmoil and causing all the family clans to break up along language lines and migrate in all directions away from the Babel area. Now, when we look at the geological history as well, and we look at climate change and what would have happened, and we think back about the fountains of the deep opening up during the flood, so a lot of very, very hot water was released at that time, as well as volcanic material. There would have been a lot of steam and clouds. There would have been quite a glasshouse effect. And then we had the rapid evaporation, which would have produced a very rapid cooling effect that would lead to an ice age. And there's quite a few creationist models that show that the flood model is the best explanation for the ice age that we have. And of course, again, the evolutionist models have these series of ice ages because they have to date it over long periods of time. But even to date, there's no satisfactory non-flood model that can explain the ice ages. There's, some of the models that are based on, sort of effects out in outer space being related to it. But those models produce changes that aren't anywhere near strong enough to produce the actual ice ages. And so when we look at the flood model, it would now put the ice age beginning to really develop about the time of the Tower of Babel. And it says, so some of these new tribal groups migrated across the land bridges into the Americas, while other groups headed into Africa. Those that went to parts of northern Europe and elsewhere could only find shelter in caves, and this is Dr. Snelling's suggestion, because of the severe weather associated with the Ice Age, and hence this whole concept of cavemen. But it makes a lot of sense as these people all migrated away, but you have an ice age in those particular areas in particular. And the tribal groups that remained in the Babel area continued on with the civilization they had already developed. But those tribal groups that moved into distant lands had a harsh time, first of all, using whatever they could, such as stone tools to hunt and even eventually clear land to develop agriculture again before finding metals to again rebuild civilizations. And some tribes didn't progress through these stages. So even as today, there were tribal groups with stone tools living contemporaneously, this Dr. Snelling words, in adjacent areas with those in metal tool civilizations. So, and of course, this is what we find exactly what he's reporting here, what he's suggesting here is that what we observe down through history and what we observe today, there were these groups that were highly civilised and based around that area there in Mesopotamia. And when you think about this, the Egyptians, who were not that far away, as Ham migrated down there, and his son Egypt founded the Egyptian culture there, and they began building pyramids. We know that when we get, for example, to Abraham's time, about 300 years later or thereabouts, we find suddenly if we look at the Pyramid of Cheops, who would have been a contemporary of Abraham, this pyramid is highly aligned, it's astronomically aligned, it's extremely accurate. And it's interesting, Josephus records that Abraham took the knowledge of mathematics and astronomy to Egypt from, of course, where he was there in Mesopotamia. And we know that that region where Abraham had already developed advanced mathematics and astronomy and particular architectural features had been developed there. So that civilization there was very advanced. And that's exactly where the Bible says that, Noah and so forth and the people in Tower of Babel, where they all moved from. Whereas if we move, to other areas, we find, of course, at that time people are, still living in jungle areas and this sort of thing and still using, primitive stone tools and so forth. Dr. Snelling writes on, not only does the evidence fit this model for a true history of man, but it has numerous implications. First, because the tribal groups that migrated to Africa, for example, arrived there after hominoids had been locally buried and fossilised, hominids rather, this would give the false impression of an evolutionary progression, particularly as the tribal groups may have looked different from the other human tribal groups and have initially used stone tools. And likewise, the supposed Stone Age to Metal Ages to civilization evolutionary progression in humanity and its culture is merely a figment of interpretation rather than being supported by the evidence. And people such as Neanderthals, who, like the Cro-Magnons, were our human relatives because even though they may have looked slightly different, they had even larger brain capacities than we have on average today. They were artistic, they buried their dead and often lived in caves because that was convenient in the climate where they were. He notes that meanwhile the tribal group that became the Australian Aborigines migrated southeast across Asia, across the land bridges down through the Indonesian islands, and eventually used rafts to paddle across the few remaining stretches of water to reach Australia, bringing the dingo with them, as some of them recall in their Dreamtime stories. And he says they would have arrived here only about 4,000 years ago, or perhaps even later, because they've always practiced circumcision, which was first instituted by Abraham. So this is some really, when we look at what we actually observe out there, it fits because there's a huge difference between the development of, civilizations based around Mesopotamia and moving out in the immediate vicinity to those groups that migrated a long way away, such as to here in Australia, and never developed metals and these sort of things. So if we again slotted these in, as he writes, finally, unlike the evolutionary view of human history that regards some people groups as less advanced and more primitive and others as more advanced and civilised, the true history of man knows nothing of racial prejudice because all people, whether dead, fossil or living, are equal and of one blood, having all descended from Noah and his family after the flood. And, of course, I've talked in other times about the evidence for the global flood is just all over the world. I mean, it's absolutely powerful. And Dr. Snelling notes this as well. He says the evidence in the Earth's rocks and surface features bears unmistakable testimony that this world and all the creatures in it were created by an intelligent designer, and this happened only thousands of years ago. A catastrophic global flood then swept away most of the life on the Earth's surface, burying many creatures in rapidly deposited sediments to produce a fossil record as the Earth's surface was reshaped by catastrophic plate tectonics. And that's exactly what we observe. That's what we can go out and see and observe today, the evidence for this. He goes on, crustal rocks were recycled and mixed with the mantle, while radioactive decay was accelerated so that the radioactive elements in the older rocks and the new lavas and intrusions now yield anomalous and old ages, contrary to so much evidence in the rocks and in the earth and the oceans and the atmosphere for a young world. So what he's saying is there's so much evidence when we look at, the data in the oceans and the atmosphere, the earth is young. And this is something I've talked about before as well. If we take the same rocks and use the four main different radioactive dating methods on those rocks, we'll get four different ages, often hundreds of millions of years apart. And matter of fact, we can get different datings for different parts of the same crystal, mineral crystal. And of course, these are, overlooked at times. And also, there seems to be a lot of evidence that during the flood, there was a major catastrophic event. It was a supernatural catastrophic event, and that there was a rapid acceleration of radiometric decay at that particular time. Of different elements at different rates. And that's perhaps something I could talk about another time in more detail. But Dr. Snelling goes on to write, the animals and people that survived this catastrophic flood in the arks, that's Noah and the animals that were saved there, repopulated the world after the flood. In the first few centuries after the flood, a rapid ice age gripped the earth, lowering sea levels to provide land bridges that further aided human and animal migration. Many organisms migrated by drifting across oceans on floating vegetation. People originally settled in the Tigris-Euphrates region with the one language and culture, but divine intervention to confuse their language caused them to migrate as tribal groups with different languages and cultures into the four corners of the earth. And so he summarised by saying, so when examined thoroughly, the geological and related evidences totally agree with the biblical account of the history of the earth and of man, causing us to acknowledge our Creator God, who not only shaped the earth and created all life on it, including us, but has been intimately involved in our history and therefore our lives. How can we not seek to know Him, our Creator? So that was this geologist. Again, first-class Oz in geology from, I think, the University of Sydney, and a PhD from the University of New South Wales, or it might be the other way around. So, and he has worked for maybe 20, maybe 30 years in the area of studying creation research. So it's quite compelling evidence that he puts together there. But I think the important point is, if humans were these hundreds of thousands of years and even up to millions of years now, they're trying to push it, where are all the artefacts of the people that lived? And the population should be much, much greater than it is. And where are all the bodies of the people that were buried? Where are all the remains? We know that people have burials. They like to preserve memories of their loved ones. The fact that those remains aren't there is powerful, powerful evidence that for the flood, and that humans all descend from Noah only about 4.5, and the flood only about 4,500 years ago. To me, this evidence is powerful and convincing that the Bible account is the true history of man. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton, and remember, if you would like to re-listen to this or any of the other programs, you can Google 3ABN Australia, all one word, .org.au. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.